All right, friends, gather on up. We'll get going here. Our plan is we've got 2 more sessions, and then we've got a final test, Q&A session. The Q&A session at the end could be something that you ask out loud, and you guys are doing great at asking questions. But if you have a question you don't want to ask out loud, there are little forms on your table, too, that you could fill out and give to me. And then, depending on how many questions we have, we can go home early and enjoy the sunshine. All right, so our third session, our third problem is the problem of evil. Why is the problem of evil a problem for those of us who are Christians? What could somebody who's not a Christian say about the problem of evil? It's normal? Okay, good. If God is good, then why do bad things happen to us? Yeah, that is that's the quintessential syllogism, right? You put those things together. Frame calls this probably the most difficult problem in all of theology. Why is it so difficult? Sin, yeah, but why is this a difficult thing?
Because everybody looks and thinks that God is just
Right, and that's not the way the world works, right? So it's not reality. We all experience evil in some way, shape, or form. With the presence of sin, whether that be people sinning against us, whether it be the effects of sin in the world, other people sinning against other people indirectly affecting us, whether it be sin in the world causing cancer or whatever else, or death or natural disasters. Look at North Carolina and all of that right now. It's hard for us because it's a real thing, because it actually happens. And so, yeah, the classic syllogism is Christians would say that the biblical God exists, he's all good, and he's all powerful. But reality says that evil exists, and we all know that. So ergo, here's the problem. Therefore, the biblical God cannot exist, or he's unable or unwilling to prevent evil. That's the big problem. We say, on the one hand, God exists, he's good, he's loving, he's all sovereign. We all know evil exists every single day. We realize that. So then the person with a problem with Christianity would then confront us and say, okay, so how could a good God allow such evil and suffering? I refuse to believe in such a God. Therefore, the God must not exist. Or if he does exist, it's even worse because he doesn't jump in and stop it and do something. And so when we talk about the problem of evil, or here's a quote from Epicurus in 300 BC, right? This is still so relevant to what we're talking about today and really how a lot of people frame the argument. He said, is God willing to prevent evil but not able? Then he's not omnipotent. Is he able but not willing? Then he's malevolent. Is he both able and willing? Then whence cometh evil? Is he neither able nor willing? Then why call him God? So what he's saying there, okay, does he want to prevent evil and he just can't? Is it out of his power to stop things? Is that the Christian God? Then he's not omnipotent. Then he's not all-powerful. Is he able to stop evil, but he just doesn't want to? Then he's a terrible God. He's an awful, awful ogre in the sky. Why would you not stop evil? Is he both able and willing? Then why do we have evil? Or is he neither? Then why on earth does he even exist? And he doesn't exist. And so there's a couple ways to look at this. First is the logical problem of evil. That is, we can look at the problem of evil and we could say, as we already said this morning many times, why does evil exist? Well, it exists because of sin. And so how can God and evil both exist? That's the logical problem. We know that it's here. We know that evil's here. So what do we do with that? How can both exist? And the practical problem of evil is more personal, though, is why is evil happening to me? You can look at this from an intellectual standpoint, and you can say, yeah, sure, evil exists because of sin. Great. Why did I get cancer? Like, it's me. Now, I understand the argument out there. Okay, if you believe the biblical worldview, cancer exists because sin's in the world. Okay, fine. But no, I'm asking, why me? Why did this happen to me? That's where the real rub comes in, right? Because why is this happening to me? What did I do to deserve this? How do I stop this? Where is God in all this? Those are the big questions of evil. So a couple definitions of evil or types of evil. First, there's moral evil. An agent causes evil. In other words, sin. I go and I punch somebody else in the face. I sinned against that person, unless they deserved it, right? Or I was defending myself. So an evil agent causes sin. And that's a huge spectrum, right? That could be assault, that could be murder, that could be whatever. Someone else sins against someone else. Moral evil. Someone breaks a law of God against someone else. Someone in government withholds food and supplies to their people. That is evil. They're corrupt. That is evil. So that's moral evil. It's sin, breaking God's moral law. There's also natural evil, where there's no agent that actually causes evil, but we see things happening that bring destruction. Case in point, tornadoes, hurricanes, tsunamis, viruses, whatever. No conspiracy theory. There's no agent involved. I saw the eyebrows go up instantly when I said viruses. There wasn't an agent involved. Right? Those things are in the world, right? And unfortunately, we see the suffering in North Carolina right now and in Georgia and elsewhere. Destruction.
But we call those things acts of God.
Would we or do we?
We do, I mean,
Well, insurance agencies do.
falls on your house or your store, well, it's an act of God.
Yeah, I think that's... Do they still actually put it like that? Yeah, they do. Act of God, okay. Which is essentially saying, not our fault. Yeah, out of our control. We didn't do anything. So these two things are related, right? We would not have natural evil if we didn't have moral evil. We wouldn't have hurricanes that destroy houses and kill thousands of people if we didn't have sin. So sin is what is responsible. And of course, we see that in Genesis 3:17, in the fall of man, the ground is cursed. He said to Adam, because you've listened to the voice of your wife and have eaten of the tree which I commanded you, you shall not eat of it. Cursed is the ground because of you. In pain you shall eat of it all the days of your life. So this is creation itself crying out, saying, I'm broken. We have hurricanes, we have tornadoes, we have terrible storms, we have viruses, we have all these things that occur in nature, right? Because of moral evil, and the ground is cursed because of sin. So there would not be any natural evil if sin didn't exist at all. I have a couple other references here. Isaiah 24:6 says, therefore a curse devours the earth, and its inhabitants suffer for their guilt. Therefore the inhabitants of the earth are scorched. And the passage I alluded to before a moment ago in Romans 8:22, yeah, it's definitely time for glasses. For we know that the whole creation has been groaning together in the pains of childbirth until now. So when we see these natural disasters, think of those words. They're groaning. Creation's groaning under the weight of sin that has cursed it. So that's natural evil. We have metaphysical evil, big word. There's a reality that goes beyond everything, metaphysical reality, and that includes the spiritual world. So we do have forces aligned against us. We do have demons. We have the prince of demons, Satan. So they are working, conniving, evil all the time against God. And then, as Johnny Mack put it in one of his teachings, we have eternal evil, which is hell. So there's the eternal evil of hell. Let's look at our friends, the worldviews. How do each of the worldviews make sense of evil? And remember, we talked about worldviews, and we talked about how this is when the rubber meets the road, okay? How are you rationalizing, processing? What are you thinking about? Why did what just happened happen in North Carolina? And why wasn't it stopped? And remember, people aren't neutral. Their worldview affects how they process truth. So your worldview determines perspective, right? Our beliefs, Walker remembers from this week that they're like a tree. We have roots that are our beliefs that lie underneath the soil. And when the tree grows, we have fruit that grows on the tree. With that fruit, oh boy. This is a historic moment, folks. October 5th, 12:40 p.m. Wow! That's what that says. This is life-changing. I have to get used to this. I lost my whole train of thought. Yeah. And evil is something that people I've seen that use when it's like really truly evil. Like if they're grasping for a word, like if unfortunately, maybe think of an extreme case where somebody assaults a child or something like that. They'll grasp for a word and they get to evil. That's just pure evil. I think that's part of what God has put inside us, that we try to recognize and resolve what's happening. So our first worldview, atheism, evil just happens. It happens randomly and without reason. If you have an atheistic worldview, and you say there is no big plan, there is no one up there controlling things, calling the shots, then what you really need to say when evil happens is, oh well. If there's nobody up there, there's nothing calling the shots, there's no plan, then evil it happens randomly and without reason. This is completely and totally hopeless and the end to an atheistic position. That's where you ultimately end up. You can't say there's a purpose for anything if there's no purpose to anything. This prevents and proves there is no God. Atheist Bertrand Russell had the powerful quote, "Anyone who has sat beside the bed of a dying child cannot believe in God." And that's a very powerful quote, It's very, very fitting. Right? Like, what did this child do to deserve this? It also says something about what we expect God to do. This worldview fails because it's inconsistent. There's not a person walking on the face of the earth who has the image of God stamped on their soul who really, truly believes that evil just happens. And it doesn't mean anything. If the old thing you would say is if the atheist gets mugged and robbed, right? And what are they going to cry? Justice! I want justice! Well, you just stepped out of your worldview. You got to stay in your own worldview box, dude. If everything's meaningless and there is no plan to anything, then you don't have a category for justice. You don't have a category for right and wrong. You've got to stay in your own worldview. But everybody will say that. I want that person found and I want him put in jail. Where does that come from? That comes from something that God put inside you to call out for justice. So everyone wants justice. It's one example. The effects of evil are real. We all know the pain of evil and want some resolution, but if it's random, there can't be any. And again, you can try to keep an atheistic worldview, but it's impossible because you will always keep jumping up out of your worldview into something else. You don't have a category for justice. You don't have a category for good and evil. You don't have a standard for it. These are all just scientific facts and naturalistic things. So if we're just bags of mostly carbon and water floating on space rocks, and one bag of carbon and water bumps into another one, oh well, stuff happens. I mean, I'll admit, it's an oversimplistic view, but that's really where you've got to get to in this. And that's part of drawing these worldviews to their logical conclusion. Okay? Second one, selfism. The existence of evil has to have a reason that who can understand? Me. If my worldview is about me, if I worship at the God of self and something evil happens to me, I want an explanation. And I want one that I can understand, and I want one that I can approve of, and I want to know who's responsible for letting this in my life right now. This fails because it's impossible, right? This is the ultimate arrogance of the self. To say that God, let's just call him God, if you believe that there was someone, you're not an atheist, you believe that there was someone controlling things, and God let this happen, the arrogance of saying that God owes me an explanation for anything that I disagree with, because let's call it just not terrible things like cancer, anything. Like, what if my life doesn't work out the way that I wanted it to? What's going on, God? I don't think you understood what was going on here. You work for me. I don't think you understood that relationship. Your job is to make my life comfortable and happy. And I prayed, and I had a list of all the things that I want you to do for me. And what's going on? Should we have a performance evaluation meeting as far as what? Because are you asleep at the job? Do I need to find a different God? Like, what? It's funny, but that's really how people live their lives, right? Like, God works for me. The cat and dog theology kind of thing again. Here's the question: why are we owed an explanation? And if we got an explanation, what makes us think that we could understand it? Why are we owed an explanation, and what makes us think that we could understand it if it was? Do you have any idea how many billions upon billions of things God is doing at any given time and how those things work together? Not just now, but ramifications for all of time? And we're supposed to understand that? We can't. This problem really came to light and was increased by the Enlightenment. In that period of time where things shifted from an objective source where we submit to God to then our own rational. Like, we need to think and we need to understand, which is fine, but then that puts us in the driver's seat. And now, of course, we have the psychological and the therapeutic self. Like, everything that happens to me, I need to be able to understand, and I need to be able to have the tools to navigate it, and I need to be able to manage it in some way, and I need to, all of that. Tim Keller wrote in a really good book. I know Tim Keller got a little squishy towards the end there, but Tim Keller put out some really, really good books, and one of them is Walking with God Through Pain and Suffering. Fantastic book. He says, as human beings became far more confident in their own powers of reason and perception. So the paradigm shifted, right? We then became the determiners of what we have to understand and not understand. And if we don't understand it, it's bad, and it must be rejected. In other words, if I cannot see or imagine any good reason for evil, there must not be one. And this is logically impossible. If I don't see any point to what I'm going through, there must not be one. That's logically impossible. This is where then our highest goal, if we're in a selfism perspective, What is our highest goal in life? Us, right? Ourselves, our flourishing, our lives. How can I dial everything in to make my life the best that I can be? And how can I be as happy as I possibly can? And how can I make all things serve me? Remember that diagram with God? You replace self in the middle of that. So all those things serve me. And so if our highest goal is our own human flourishing through our own independence and autonomy, the existence of God is a barrier to that. Wait, hold on. There's somebody that actually calls the shots up there? No, that's me. I call the shots up there. So I can't believe in a God that would let things happen without my permission. That's really what selfism is. That's why this fails. It's impossible. And the temptation then is to reinvent God to make him understandable. And we see a lot of this even in the Christian church. I can't understand God. I can't understand why this would happen. I can't understand this evil. So I'm going to just tweak my definition of God so that I can make him a little bit more understandable. There's a couple of theologies that are false theologies. One of them is process theology, where God is developing and changing in response to circumstances. So in other words, God's kind of started the world, but as things develop, God then reacts to those things and changes his plan. That's process theology. That's alive and well. And it's alive and well in a lot of progressive churches. Another one is open theism. There are some things that God can control. There are some things that God knows, but there are some things that God doesn't know. There are some things that God doesn't even control. In other words, God is not, the big word that Chris used before, sovereign. If open theism is true, God is not sovereign. There are some things that God just can't know, can't control. And a third reinvention of God is what we might call dualism. This one is as old as creation itself. There is a war, good versus evil. God is on one side, Satan is on the other side, and some days God wins, and other days Satan wins. God must have been sleeping one day, and Satan got one past him. That's dualism. Of course, I hope you know, and I can tell by your snickers, that none of those are biblical at all. So let's look at what is biblical. See if I can get this in the right direction. Theism. Biblical theism. Here's the biblical response to the problem of evil. God is sovereign over all things, including evil. Sovereign means absolute, total control over every single aspect of God's creation. And you see how it's tied into creation. If God's not the creator, then he really can't be sovereign over it. Then he's just kind of like a hired manager. But if God created it, he knows why he created it, he knows how it all works together, and he controls it. Think about it. If you create something, anything, you knew why you created it, you know what you created it for, you know how it works, and you can uncreate it at any time because you own it. The biblical view is that God is sovereign over all things, including evil. That makes us a little uncomfortable. Another Johnny Mack quote: "If you're having trouble accepting that God is sovereign, then think a while about the possibility of him not being sovereign." If you can't really accept that God is sovereign, then think about the possibility of him not being sovereign. What he's trying to say there is, think about the possibility that there really are things that God doesn't control. Really? Like there really are times when evil just wins the day? How's that? Is it going to get worse? Like, is it going to get better? How do we know? So God's either sovereign or he's not. He's not just a little sovereign. He's completely sovereign. Now, in the Bible, there are these, what my systematic theology professor, my first ones, called them spectrum texts. These are some scary verses in the Bible. Deuteronomy 32. 39. See now that I, even I, am he, and that there's no God beside me. I kill, I make alive, I wound, and I heal, and there is none that can deliver me out of my hand. It's like some of us I know were like, I did not know that verse was in the Bible. And that's probably why I don't read the whole Bible, because there's scary stuff in there that I don't want to see, right? What? That's why Dr. Ware called them spectrum texts. Like God kills, he makes alive. He wounds and he heals. And there's none that can deliver out of his hand. 1 Samuel chapter 2. We wrestled with this in their men's Bible study groups. 1 Samuel chapter 2, verses 6 and 7. The Lord kills and brings to life. He brings down to Sheol and raises up. And one more in Isaiah 45, verse 7. This is God speaking. I form light and create darkness. I make well-being and I create, actually in King James it says evil. It is the Hebrew word rach, which means evil. I make well-being and create evil. I am the Lord who does all of these things. Does these make you feel a little bit uncomfortable? What makes us uncomfortable about these verses? It's a safe space. He creates evil. No, we definitely don't want to hear that. We don't even know how that's possible, which we'll talk about in a second. What else makes us uncomfortable about this? Almost bragging?
Yeah.
Okay.
Like to me, it's like I do all these things. You know what I mean? Like I doesn't matter what it is you think, I can do it all.
Yep.
So
Yep. Yeah. Okay. Yep.
It makes you think he's capable of so much more than we see him doing.
Mm-hmm.
And then it makes you realize how much mercy he shows us each and every day because he can just smote us.
Yeah. You have to get there.
Like I just,
Smited us, smoted us. Yes, you did the chicken. You smited one of our chickens. True story. It was a chicken who was ill, and we were going away, and my wife literally prayed the chicken would.
Joanne was watching the chickens.
Oh, that's right. Joanne was going to watch the chickens. And so she prayed for the chicken to die, and it died the next day. I know. Like, wow, what else can you do? Yeah, and I think what Mel said is so important to complete it the way she did, because we could camp on that first part of being, whoa, hey, time out. God creates evil. God's sovereign over evil. I hate that. And we could stay there. Instead of carrying it through to, wow, look at how merciful and gracious God truly is, that he allows me to breathe his air and doesn't turn me into a smoldering pile of dust. That's amazing. And that shows our view of God, right? Again, selfism creeps into the Christian worldview a lot more than we think. Verses like this, you cannot walk away from these verses and not have a high view of God's sovereignty and what he is. Like, there's nothing he doesn't know. There's nothing he doesn't do. Yeah. You were going to say something?
Can you elaborate on that? Because this is the first that I hear that. I'm trying to grasp it, but it's
Yep,
not
we will.
happening.
We'll get there. Don't worry. If your head is hurting, that's good. It's a good sign. We're going there. We're going there right now. I know. I've let you be uncomfortable long enough, okay? So here's the main challenge then. If we get to this point, then like you all are thinking, what does this mean? Does this mean God is the author of sin? This is the main challenge. Is God the author of sin? Like, he can't do that. There's no sin in him whatsoever. He's completely pure. He's completely opposite of sin. So how can God create evil? How can God do those things? We have to stand firmly on the biblical worldview and say wholeheartedly, God is not the author of sin. We are the author of sin. We're the ones that turned. See Genesis chapter 3. We're the ones that turned. God is the author of sin. I mean, God is not the author of sin. Human beings are. Now, if he created humans with free will, He knew they would choose sin. So then is he sort of still ultimately the responsibility of that? Like, because God created us, he knew that we would reject him. So God's still in trouble. God's still to blame because he's the ones that created us with the capacity to sin in the first place. Here's the answer where we've got to get to, okay? And this is really the crux of this, and this is the answer to the problem of evil, the biblical answer to evil. You're not going to like it. I don't like it. But he did not create evil, but he sovereignly ordains evil. He's not responsible for evil. We are. But God sovereignly ordains it. And that's where it's such a comfort that God is sovereign over even evil. One of my professors years and years ago described it as God stands indirectly behind evil, using it for his purposes, redeeming it for his purposes. It's there. Evil exists. We all know it exists, and it exists because we rebelled against God. But God's sovereign over it and uses it in the midst of it. Wayne Grudem, in his systematic theology, said even a verse such as Isaiah 45, which speaks of God creating evil, does not say that God himself does evil, but should be understood to mean that God ordained that evil would come about through the willing choices of his creatures. The willing choices of his creatures, and all of it is baked together in the plan of God. And it hurts our brains because we're not God. We have to be aware at this point of the temptation to let God off the hook. And many Christians go through some really bad theology to try and let God off the hook. It's a big word called a theodicy, which is a defense of God. And so we're in the position then of trying to defend God and saying, well, no, there's a logical reason for this. And so I'm going to step through a bunch of theodicies here that we might be tempted to get into. No, not that, not that, that. I don't know why I'm pointing this at the screen. It has absolutely nothing to do with the screen whatsoever. It's up there. Okay, so here's the first theodicy. The illusion theodicy. And different worldviews have these different theodicies in ways of trying to rationalize evil. The illusion theodicy says evil doesn't exist, it's an illusion. Therefore, God can't be blamed. I believe Buddhism would feel this way. I said Christian Science. I have to check that out to make sure that's actually the case. But the evil's just actually an illusion. Whatever we feel is not actually here. It's just working for other purposes, right? That fails because of duh. Fails from the duh argument because reality. The pain of evil is real, so therefore evil is actually real. It doesn't matter how we react to our circumstances. It's here. We know evil's here. We know it's real. So the illusion theodicy fails. There's another one called the best possible world theodicy. The best possible world theodicy. And God couldn't create perfect beings because they would be God. So therefore, God did the best he could and created human beings. And they're just going to, fail. But this was the best God can do, knowing that there had to be some evil and sin in the mix. That fails because God is free to make things perfect or imperfect. And second, how are we supposed to know what is the best world anyway? So the best possible world excuse fails. And there's the all-popular free will theodicy, which is partly true. The free will theodicy, that God had to preserve our free will, and therefore the potential for us to choose evil had to be there, so therefore God can't be blamed. We're trying to get God off the hook here, saying, well, it's just us. We're the ones that chose to do evil, and God can't control our wills. Except he can, right? That fails because God is sovereign and man is responsible. Many sermons, especially at midweek, we've been talking about the balance that we have to have in life. God is absolutely 100% sovereign over all things, and we are also 100% responsible for our actions and our choices. We can't say the devil made me do it, and we can't say God made me do it either. We are responsible. John Frame, in his apologetics book, says, even when Scripture specifically mentions God's foreordination of an evil agent, the blame for the evil rests exclusively with the human perpetrators. And we have some examples. Old Testament Israel, Pharaoh, the Jewish leaders, the Romans who put God on the cross. Age-old question, who crucified Jesus? There's lots of answers for that, right? But some people go right to the Romans and the Jews. The ultimate answer is God the Father, right? But God the Father is such a great example for trying to wrestle through this problem. God the Father allowed the evil that was lodged in the hearts of the Jews and the Romans to put his son on the cross in order to do what? To bring about his plan of salvation. And they will be held responsible. Imagine being that guy, the guy who drove the nails into Jesus, standing before Jesus on Judgment Day. He will be held responsible. And he could not say it was because, oh, well, just evil exists in the world. You've got to cut me a break. It's like, no, you're responsible. I was just doing your plan. It's like, I know, and you did it with all your heart. It was your choice.
Is this a paradox then? God's sovereignty and man's free will? It's a paradox. It's got to be breaking out.
I don't know if it's a paradox in as much as just truths held in tension. They both have to be there, right? It's the two trains of the train tracks and the two wings of the airplane. There's so many things in Scripture that we want to resolve, but we can't. And we shouldn't, because this is our God. We can't just resolve God. We can't just say that God is all of these things and we've figured them out. So I would say it's just more two truths that have to stay in tension, and that's the way God designed it, to have that balance. It can't be one or the other. It can't be the extreme. It can't be we're the only ones who are in charge, but then God involves our free will and has to have both, right? He involves our free will in his plan. Yeah. We were talking outside at lunch, a cheerful discussion of people going to hell, and we said that the people that reject Christ because they don't want to accept Christ. They want to reject him. They want no part of him. And they will continue to reject him until the day they die. Did God know that? Absolutely. Ow! Right? That's the sovereignty we're talking about here. Yeah. Where are we going here? Oh, yep, that's right where we are now. It plays into the most important thing is our free will. So it's saying that what we choose freely is more important than God's plan. That our ideas, right, our choice then should supersede God and his plan. Or that we have to understand everything that's going on in our own free will. And when you're dealing with the God of the universe, we can't understand everything. That's such like a basic Christian truth that not a lot of Christians either think about. I'm not okay with it either. Do we have a bear coming in there? No. It's very difficult for us to think about because we're human beings. We're meaning makers. We want to figure everything out. We're Americans. We need to figure everything out. But we can't with God, and we shouldn't. What does that say about how highly we need to regard God? If we have a God where we can figure everything out about him, he's not God. I don't want to worship that God. We worship a God that is far above us and not like us and has his own ways that aren't ours, and I'm thankful. I thank God often that he is not like ourselves or like me. Another one is the greater good I think I got to change the slide. The greater good, this is the one we go to quite often. It says that God will always bring about a greater good from evil. If God's bringing evil in your life, there must be a reason for it. There is a reason for it. It's because God allowed it to happen. Beyond that, we may or may not ever see a reason for it. Again, this kind of leaks into the God owes me an explanation for it. Whatever happened, I need to know what that reason was. I had a woman in my office this week who lost her husband suddenly, was there 1 minute and dead the next. And she was firmly in this camp of there's supposed to be a reason for this. Where's the reason? Devastated, hysterical about it. Where's the reason? Demanding a reason. I want to know what the reason was that God took my husband. I don't know. And we can't, we play into this reason that there is a reason beyond God's will. That's the part we're not comfortable with, right? If we were purely okay with our biblical worldview, we could just say, because that's what God decided. And I know he's good, and I know he's gracious, and be okay with that. But we're human beings, and we struggle with it, and it's okay to struggle with it. It's okay to go through that. And it's okay to ask why. But God does not owe us an explanation for what he does. And that's really, really hard. Sometimes we will see a reason, but not 100% of the time. I think it was Piper that said God's always doing billions of things at any given moment, and you might be able to see one or two of them. We don't get always let in behind the curtain of what God is doing, but he does give us those things every once in a while to show us what he's doing. Of course, it is character building, it is soul building, it is for our growth and our maturity, it is for God's glory, but it can't just be because, God's going to bring something better. If God brings us evil, it doesn't necessarily mean something good or something better is going to come into our life after that. We can't say that. Two more. Ex lex theodicy, God is above the law. God can do whatever he wants. That fails because God's just not arbitrarily evil. It's not like God has like the James Bond license to kill and he's just like, I can do what I want. No, because his character is bound up with his law. And then another one we frequently go to is the fallen world theodicy. We brought sin into the world, not God. Don't blame God. God's off the hook. But if God's really sovereign, this is the point. I know some of this stuff gets thick, but this is the point, is we should not try to get God off the hook. God's shoulders are big enough for his worldview to include evil and use it for his purposes. And that's what we're uncomfortable with. So it's not just because of sin. It doesn't even answer the question in the fallen world theodicy. It doesn't prove that he isn't responsible. It just says that we are. But he's still the one who created the world at the end of the day. So we all know that he is somewhat responsible. It's not a defense of God. It's just getting him or trying to get him off the hook. It doesn't answer the question. And we could never say that the devil made me do it, or as we saw in Genesis 3, it was the woman that you gave me. There is human responsibility for choosing sin. So we can't just blame sin. So where does this leave us apologetically and spiritually? I know you're all discouraged right now. The ultimate answer, Christians, we've got to have complete confidence in this answer. And the reality is, why does evil happen to us sometimes, not other times? Why do particular things happen to us and not other times? We've got to be able to stand on it and say, we don't know. I'm not God. That is not a cop-out. We do more damage to God when we try to give it a reason. We're way over our heads. And when I would walk with people through terrible, terrible tragedy, and they're crying, and why did this happen? Why did this happen? I am so tempted to tap out and go to a platitude. I'm so tempted to be like, well, God's going to bring something better into your life, or there's a reason for all things, or something like that. But everybody knows that's not really true. we've got to say, hold on one second, we've got to say two things. I don't know why this happened to you, but I know God is here with you and he loves you. And he does. What were you going to say, Trudy?
I was going to say that you said we can't say that God's going to do something better.
Yeah.
But in fact, he is. As he says, my plans are for your success,
Yep.
for your good. So,
Sure.
I can look at that and say, the loss is there. I don't know why exactly, but I know that God is going to bring me something.
Right. And two things.
No matter what it is, it's going to be good for my, right? Isn't that what he says?
Yes, but two things that just to clarify that, right? First thing is, what's your definition of good?
What he thinks is good for me.
There we go. Romans 8, famous verse, right? Romans 8:28. And we know that for those who love God, all things work together for good, for those who are called according to his purpose. In your Bibles, put together verse 28 and 29, because you can't define verse 28 without 29, because he defines the good in verse 29. What's the good? Verse 29. For those whom he foreknew, he also predestined to be conformed to the image of his Son, in order that he might be the firstborn among many brothers. So we have to define the good not as we define it, but what God defines it. And according to Romans 8:28, how we define good is being more conformed to the image of his Son. And will he use tragedy and evil and all of that to do that? You better believe it. 1,000%. Way more than success. Way more than prosperity. Way more than when times are good and easy. Why don't the major growth times happen when everything's happy and there are puppies and sunshine? And why don't we grow much during those times? We're comfortable. Everything's good. What? Oh, right. Yep. But when God has your full attention, when your face is in the dirt, because there's evil all around you, I think it was Spurgeon again, God does his best work in the dark. It's like, ugh. And thank God. Thank God for that. That when we go through a darkness like that, that my Savior's in the midst of that, working that for my good. How depressing and discouraging and completely without hope to have such a worldview that either God can't do anything in the midst of that time or he didn't even know what was happening and is not even aware. But in the midst of this, we don't know why those specific things happen. We don't have an airtight theodicy, and we don't need one. And it's really time for some refreshing honesty, not the pithy sayings that we have on our coffee cups. God is God and I am not. That's all I got. Which, if we don't know the God of the Bible, is not going to comfort us very much. But if we know the God of the Bible, who is good, who is merciful, who is long-suffering, who is gracious, who is forgiving, who is eternal, then yeah, I can trust that God. No matter what he's bringing in my life right now, I can trust him. And that was the other thing I was going to say in response to that, Trudy, is we have to think longer term. Like, we think, okay, God's going to bring good tomorrow or before I die. Maybe not. But when we die and we stand before God for eternity in heaven, that's good. That's real good. He will redeem that time. And so we've got to think longer term, too. We've got to think eternally, too. Some people will never have resolution to the evil in this life. They won't, but they sure will the next life. And I believe 2 Corinthians backs me up, that the more you suffer in this life, you're only increasing your capacity for what you will receive in the next life, because you will appreciate it so much more. You will say, oh, Lord, I'm being prepared for a weight of glory, right? That far outweighs what I'm going through in this life, in the next. Yeah.
I was just saying, bouncing off what Judy, I think especially as, as women and as moms, we kind of want to see the end.
Yeah.
If we're
Yeah.
We want to look for that good, which is not a bad thing at all.
Yeah.
And also remember in Isaiah where it says his ways are not our ways. So God may not be working the way or as quickly, as we want him to, but he plays the long game.
Mm-hmm.
And it's that patient endurance
Mm-hmm.
that we've been talking about.
Mm-hmm. Yep. And I think part of that, too, I'll probably get to this in the application section in a minute, is preparing to suffer, preparing to feel the effects of evil. So much of when I'm a pastor called into a tragic situation is just dealing with the shock that someone has that a terrible situation just happened to them. It's like they weren't even ready for it. They didn't even have the capacity. Like, wait a minute. And that's where you start to see somebody's beliefs subtly seep into their real life. Like, this is not God's job. Again, he's here to make me happy and healthy. So what gives? Well, that's not God's job. Like, so now you have to untangle theology in the middle of this tragedy, which is tragic in and of itself. It's like, no, we should be aware that evil exists. And yes, it could affect any one of us at any time. And that is going to minimize the shock when it actually does happen to it, and we remember and we trust God in the midst of it. So the ultimate answer is we don't know, and we have to be conscious of that answer. We also need to remember the limitations and goals of apologetics. I will never, as a pastor, nor will any of you ever be able to give anyone an explanation that will completely make everything okay. And I had to say that to the sobbing woman in my office this week. I will never be able to tell you anything that will completely heal your hurt for the loss of your husband. I can't. Evil happened. It happened. And neither can we explain the problem of evil beyond all doubts. And so then our purpose is to provide a contextual, compassionate, and compelling defense of the faith that stimulates serious consideration. And each one of those is very, very important. We have to provide a contextual, compassionate, and compelling defense of the faith that stimulates serious consideration. And I want to go back to these diagrams that I think we saw. I think I had them in one sermon a while ago. But if this is our view of God, right? If we're the creature, it's our world, and God's just kind of orbiting around it, that's a false worldview. When you hit a problem of evil, you're going to be devastated with this worldview. It will be very hard for you to recover, and it will take a long time. Neither is it that creature and creator are together. So that's pantheism, right? That's everything is God. We live in this spiritual zone, and everything somehow works yin and yang. But we've got to make this creator-creature distinction. The creator is bigger than us. We get our existence from the creator, and we have a relationship with him through knowledge of the creator. So he's separate from us, and our existence comes from him, and then our knowledge and our fulfillment comes through knowing him. And so what do we do then? What is our defense to the problem of evil? A couple of things. First, we need to explain the biblical worldview. The big story of the Bible. Again, the eternal big story of the Bible. That God created the world, that we fell into sin, that God dealt with sin by giving us his Savior Jesus, and that one day he will return to restore all things to the perfect creation and banish evil forever. In the big story of the Bible, we've got to finish it, right? We want to leave it in this life where it's like Jesus will just dry all your tears and he will make sense of everything and tell you why everything's happening. That's shortchanging the big story of the Bible. The big story of the Bible goes all the way to the end, when God will banish evil forever. That's what we've got to take encouragement. And we've got to be able to look at each other in the face of evil and say, yeah, some days it sucks here. And some days evil does impact us. But one day that won't happen. Right? That's where we've got to get to. So it's the big hope that he will do something to fix evil forever. One quote said that though we cannot understand the origin of evil, we do know the future of evil. We can't understand the origin of evil. We do know the future of it. And God will destroy it one day in judgment. And of course, that brings us to the truth that he has done something to fix evil forever. And when you're sitting with someone who is grieving or when you're going through something that is terrible, evil, we have to bring it back to Christ. We have to bring it back to the truth is he did do something. This is why he came. The very pain that we're feeling right now in this evil is the whole reason that Jesus came to fix it. And that work is done. And we need to trust in him for the rest of the story. That's why Good Friday is Good Friday, right? So we need to explain the biblical worldview centered on the gospel. We need to emphasize the sovereignty of God, that God must be in total control of his creation in order to be God, that whatever just happened did not happen without his knowledge, and really did not happen without his permission, and really did not happen outside of his plan to glorify himself, to make us more mature. And then maybe more to the point of defending the faith, we need to assert that the existence of evil doesn't necessarily mean that God can't exist. So there's evil. Why does that mean God can't exist? Just because we can't see reasons for evil doesn't necessarily mean that there aren't any. There could be reasons we don't see, and there are reasons that we don't see, for sure. We know that the rest of the world clearly brings good from evil. There are life-saving medical treatments that cause pain in the process. There are disciplining children in order to train them. There's the pain of personal growth. There's the pain of loss that eventually brings life. There are things we know countless occasions where good has come from evil. Why can't it work this way with God? We just somehow say, well, God didn't stop it, so he doesn't exist. No, that's not the way life works. We have the models of all kinds of good coming from evil. I would not be standing here today as a pastor were it not for 9/11. Were it not for the terrorist attacks in New York City. Well, spoken like a true Calvinist, I probably would be. He probably would have drawn me to himself some other way. But that's what he used to draw me to himself, was unspeakable tragedy. Right? So we know that evil or good comes from evil. Why do we have to just say that God doesn't exist if there's evil? And lastly, and maybe most powerfully, why are they asking us for a justification for evil? What's their idea? What is your, okay, so evil exists in the world. At arguing about that. We all know that. What's your explanation for it from your worldview? And they won't have one. At least one that doesn't make sense as much as the biblical worldview. So this should cause our worship to soar to new heights when we think about who God is. Again, in Romans 11:33, oh, the depths of the riches and wisdom and knowledge of God. How unsearchable are his judgments, and how inscrutable are his ways. For who has known the mind of the Lord, and who has been his counselor? Who has given a gift to him that he might be repaid? For from him and through him and to him are all things. To him be glory forever. Amen. That should cause us to worship this God all the more passionately. And so evil exists because the sovereign God allows it to exist for his purposes. This little talk had a big idea. That would be it. It's not a very melodic big idea. But evil exists because the sovereign God allows it to exist for his purposes. And we have to trust that sovereign God. Thoughts, questions, comments? I see lots of furrowed brows. Lots of deep thoughts. Yeah, Joanne. If I think I understood your question, I would say both. We're not guaranteed to see the good in this lifetime, right? Oftentimes we do. And we can always see, if we work along with the trial instead of resisting it, we can always see the good that God will grow in us through it, 100%. But God doesn't owe us an explanation for it. And so, yeah, we might not see it in this lifetime. There are plenty of people who go through a lot of tragedy and evil that don't have a satisfactory explanation for why it happened this life. But again, continue the story. In eternity, it's not going to matter. It really isn't. And we can suffer in really, really big ways today. We can. But in eternity, when every tear is dried and we are in the presence of God himself, we are going to be completely fulfilled. Does that help? Okay. Others?
Super upset why me, how did I lose it? The person that almost died is super adaptable, goes scuba diving, like lives life with such passion. And it's crazy because they're both missing the same thing. One had it, one never had it, and you can see the complete opposite differences in how they accept that kind of.
Yeah. That's actually very profound, right? Because let's realize that as Americans, that sense of entitlement just creeps into our very being of who we are. Like, we think we're entitled to a good, problem-free life. And a lot of times we have it. Let's face the other thing. A lot of times we do have it. And so when it goes away, we're just like, whoa, 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 what just happened? This is not the way it's supposed to be. It's like, well, define what's supposed to be. Like, God's the one who does that, not you. It's tough because it pushes against every fiber in our being, right?
I wrote something here, just kind of point of thought. It said, God understands his creation to know what's good for it, even suffering.
Mm-hmm.
That was kind of like what I got.
Yeah.
Took away from it.
Yep. Yep. Other thoughts?
Back to what she was saying in Matthew 13:17, when Christ was saying, many prophets and righteous men desired to see what you see now, but didn't. Means that they would live there if they didn't see the goodness of Christ because it was after them.
Right.
They still believed and trusted God.
Yep. Yep. That's that faith and that trust. That's what's got to propel us in the midst of this, that I know the character of my God, and I know the end of the story, and I'm going to trust him in the middle of whatever storm I'm having right now. Yeah, because he's with us in it. Again, for an atheist, it's like, okay, so all this just suffering just happens. That's it. Or for someone who doesn't believe God is sovereign, like it just happens and he's not in control of anything, that's not comforting either. The only comfort is that we do have a sovereign God who is in control of all this, and he's good. And we can trust him, even in the midst of the storm. All right, let's take a quick little break, and then we'll be back at it. What I'm thinking we'll do is just nix the last session and just combine any other questions you might have at the end of this upcoming session here. So if you do have questions and you don't want to ask them out, you can write them down on your card and get them to me or Mel. It's my lovely assistant. Yeah.